I want to say we're going to begin with a piece of music. And I'll just tell you, it is played by our friend Ruben Yasavan, a very fine pianist, but also a composer in his own right.
And who was there?
And it is called the Easter Procession. It's one of the series of musics created by Gurdjieff and Hartmann. And I wanted us to start with the music for reasons I will say afterwards. So let us take a slight breath. And Peter, are we ready for you doing that? Thank you, Peter. Okay. Well, welcome, everyone. Uh, Launched this audacious, if I might say it, uh, theme of the fourth way and its future. And it is rather a wide-ranging sort of topic because it involves, as I will shortly be speaking, involvement of the positioning of Gurdjieff's work in history, especially in the history of the 20th century. And it is a very, uh, how to say it, has a very wide embrace in terms of its connections with science and art and psychology, and also the way in which our technology is changing. So, as I was saying to Peter before we started, there's like a subject like this would want to be able, ideally, to present all of the factors all at once together. But of course, you can't do that in speech, so you have to break it into the sequence of things. And so I can only tell you that out of this, perhaps I can modestly call it simply a cloud of things, I hope something will be selected from time to time, which you can make a connection with. Because each one of you will that we receive and read and think in a way peculiar to you. And it is, of course, can be quite difficult for somebody in my position to think, because I don't know you in detail, but I gather and feel you have probably amongst yourselves a very wide distribution of familiarity with the subject already. You really are accomplished in many facets of it and have your own inspiration and interests. But first of all, say why I start with the music. This is mainly inspired by something which I've always kept in front of me or with me, and that is when Gurdjieff usually had readings from his own works, particularly Beelzebub at the Prairie. The story is that he would, with Thomas de Hartmann, compose a piece of music, and this would be played before they heard the reading. And I've always felt this to be supremely important. It was exemplary of his approach to this mutual involvement of these three aspects I should talk about later of our, we call it our psychology, our nature, and so on, an idea which he followed through with incredible in creativity and ingenuity. But it's, I hope, conveys the idea empirically of the importance of having the right feelings, so to speak, to be able to actually listen to things which you couldn't ordinarily call ideas. And if you don't do that, don't have this emotional, call it, feeling component, then you can't properly understand what is being said. Now, I briefly mentioned a reference to the context of the 20th century, and I want to start with a very straightforward and very crude picture of things at the turn of the 20th century, because for most of my life I've been brought up to consider that a time of some incredible incursion. And whereas friends of mine, such as Pensinger, had addressed this in particular, and Alice Bailey and other wise people, it was as if, and forgive me, I say this is my picture, you don't have to accept it, it was as if some new energy came into the world. And around the turn of the 20th century, all kinds of radical changes occurred in many fields. Well, we just had music, and there's tremendous uh, experiments, you could say, or changes of method in music, which came, so you say, particularly sort of music of Schoenberg, which he attempted to change the whole way in which music was composed, which was treated by many of the ordinary population as disturbing and so on. Then, of course, in painting, people like Paul Klee and Kandinsky. Kandinsky, who actually, was a friend of Thomas de Hartmann, the composer I mentioned just now. So breaking away from the 19th century with its almost exclusive tendency to try and represent nature to a way of getting inside nature. And even I mentioned Kandinsky, such abstract painters who were very influenced by theosophy into the spiritual forces behind nature. And then, of course, in psychology, with the famous awakening to this idea of the unconscious, represented by Freud and various other people, and in philosophy too, with the hermeneutics which derived from Husserl. And these people were variously influenced by an extraordinary man, Brentano, who established a certain pattern, new pattern of thinking, and so on and so on. But one particular feature of this period was that it can be taken to mark this sort of a turning point in the exchange between East and West. And on, saying that even as I have made a little booklet once on a guide and index to In Search of the Miraculous, the book written by Ouspensky about Gurdjieff's teachings, mostly in Russia, and said, there were people coming into Moscow, like Pierre Vieux-Lacan from the Sufis, and it was happening too, and increasingly towards the end of the century, people from India and Tibet, and coming from the East to the West. And it was a time when still then the majority of people were stuck in their sort of local ethnic traditions. And so it's like when my teacher, John Bennett, was a young guy then, it's assumed everybody would be a Christian. But gradually these other religions came in. And it was, in a way, liberating and disturbing. And of course, the major visible impact was made by the First World War, which brought, one can easily say, I think, but simply say, that it was a revelation of the stupidity of the human race, like no other before. Millions of people dying out of idiocy. So it was into this world that Gurdjieff came, and he was part of, but a particular kind of part of, this exchange between East and West. And I want you to do as you can to really envisage this, the kind of changes which happened with technology, partially, enabling travel, and then beginning of electronic communications and so on, that this brought about a meeting between the cultures of a nature which hadn't been seen before. Part of which was, as I say, liberating, but part of which, for many people, disturbing. Because if one can make a generalization, which is disturbing but crude in a way, but actually true, is that most people do not like new things. And people are disturbed by the unknown. But it was as if the unknown decided to reveal itself in new ways at that time period. And even I know my father was connected with the fundamentalist church. He said they have some kind of notion amongst some of them that the Holy Ghost returned into the churches again at the beginning of the 20th century. And so some of this feeling was mythological, but you can't imagine this disruption, the disturbance, the whole nature of the planet at that time. So that's a group picture of it, but it's important to remember because Gurdjieff was part of something which was some process. We can't assume that anybody or anything was particularly in charge of it, but it was a very radical process. A conventional society breaking down in all directions. And of course, tremendous resistance to this, because most people, as I said before, prefer the familiar. And so we had the beginnings of what a commentator called future shock, at the sense of the future coming in, which was threatening in a way not thought before. And I'll just say one particular thing, and when I say not thought before, because the Victorian period before, in the 19th century, was a period where there was a strong theme of progress. And obviously the idea of progress was a Victorian thing. It was in the 19th century. They had this confidence after the riches released by the Industrial Revolution that this would enable them, people and everything, to get better and better, obviously flying in the face of the misery of large parts of the human population, but still it was there. And the establishments were always full of this sense of optimism and the rest of it. But it was the beginning of the 19th century, this optimism was shattered. Then came this character, Gurdjieff. There's so much uncertainty about his life, who he was, where he came from, and stories he told about it, can be quite seriously questioned and so on. And I will say in advance that he did a great deal to hide what was going on in his early life, and to say ahead of time perhaps that it's important to notice his father was an ashok, as it was called, and I mean in term for a bard or a singer and a teller of stories. And so Gurdjieff was brought up in the atmosphere of the 10,001 Nights of the Sherazada, and this telling of stories which is so part of his tradition. But I'm going to take the story of his coming to Russia, and tell you one of his sayings, which I won't be able to explain, but I think it's important to frame the narrative I'm into. And that his saying was, begin in Russia, end in Russia. I don't quite know what the end in Russia would mean, but it certainly was the beginning. And he, whatever reason, he arrived in Moscow in Russia as a millionaire in terms of wealth and so on. He had done very lucrative deals with to do with the oil business in Azerbaijan, which was then a center of oil production. And he was very well connected in Russia. He tells us where he met his wife, who was a lady in waiting at the court of the Tsar, and married her. And one wonders about this afterwards, found himself caught up. Of course, the World War started in 1914, and then there was the Bolshevik Revolution, and because of that, all his wealth disappeared almost overnight. But while he was in Moscow, he went there to set up his institute, and his institute was called the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And this notion of harmonious development is a very important part of his vision. He then had the task, and I'll try and explain that this was very important for understanding his mission or approach to entice people, to attract people. And it's interesting his connection with Ouspensky. Ouspensky was a journalist, but how Gurdjieff became, or he had learnt, and before Russia, but he was applied it there very much, was the master of media, of newspapers and that kind of thing. And he began to do two things. One was to insert into newspapers certain stories. And actually, this was a technique which years later, somebody following him up, but Idris Shah, did the same thing. He announced his coming and his operation, advertised it, if you like, through seeding articles in magazines. And at that time, that was the mass media. No electronics, of course. And there was two things he did. One was this incredibly, it's such an interesting document, if you find it, called Glimpses of the Truth, which has stages this conversation with a seeker coming and meeting this extraordinary man. And that kind of mythology of this mysterious man from the East who really knew something which ordinary people didn't know, he seeded into the population, which attracted interest in him eventually, even though he doesn't give his name in it. It gave this enticement. And this factor of an enticement is very important to realize. Because Gurdjieff was a very practical man in all spheres of his life. So he knew he had to collect people. And one of the competitions he faced was the theosophy. The intellectuals of Moscow were awash in theosophy and following the doctrines of Blavatsky and so on. So I think Gurdjieff realized he had to do something which sort of competed with them in what they were saying or what she was saying. But the other thing was this extraordinary thing which he was working on, which was advertised also in the media of the time. He was creating a ballet called The Struggle of the Magicians. Now I'm just realizing, the limitations of my time. I wondered how I can summarize this so quickly as I need to. And that is this incredible thing which he worked on for at least 20 years with various people. And in this ballet, which if you don't know it, it's the struggle between the black and white magicians. And in a way, it's very simplistic, with the black magicians looking ugly and doing music and dances which are dissonant and awkward, whereas the white magicians look beautiful and did nice things and so on. But he wove into that certain things of his teaching and this was put inside the thing, which is also a cultural document, because he embraced all these different cultural things and showed all these different dances, different instruments, and his portrayal of this life in this magical land. And all that's left of it now are just 6 pieces of music which survived, and some paintings by Alexander Stoltzman, which depict scenes from this and so on. But I just want you to remember that because he was steeped in art. Then, he had pupils in Russia, and from this came this remarkable document by Ouspensky. Ouspensky, in his own way, was a genius, and his way, his book, The Insert of Miraculousism, incredible, it was meta document, a way which actually created a pattern for doing such things and transmitting to people what the teaching was like. Now, but where did Gurdjieff come from? In his second book after Beelzebub, well, it's not what it's, we'll call it the second book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, he talks about various brotherhoods, and in particular the one he belonged to, the Brotherhood of the Seekers of the Truth. And so he portrayed himself of coming from a group of people who had worked together in Central Asia and were connected with travels in Central Asia. And this was part of this incredible going on exchange between East and West. And I think one needs to reflect on this as a two-way process. Because in a way, you could say, well, in crude terms, from the West, they were getting technology, from the East, they were getting wisdom, or something like that, or the inner life from the East and the outer life from the West. This brotherhood, we're not sure who they were, whether they were. And here I'm going to jump to the description which Gurdjieff gave to this incredible scholar he met, called Denis Thorat, whose own writings I very much admire. I really adore his two books, Death and a Dreamer and The Gods of the People. A very extraordinary man. He was a scholar of both English and French literature, like William Blake and Victor Hugo and so on. And he got a copy, which is jumping forward in time now to 1930, a copy of Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, and became a total admirer of it. And he called it, the creation of a new mythology. So this is important to keep in mind, a mythology. And he even called it an extraterrestrial mythology. But the thing I want to draw attention to was the remarkable conversation he had with Gurdjieff at the Prairie. Remarkable in many respects because of its content, but also the style in which it appears at this time, for even whatever reason, that Gurdjieff was very forthcoming, very clear, down to earth in his conversation with Denis Thorat. And so we just said to him, that he said, I was with a group of people and we looked into the remnants of ancient wisdom. And he said it was all sorts of things, not in text, but monuments and legends and all kinds of whatever it was, a diversity of influences of these remnants of the past. And he came to the conclusion this wisdom, and he obviously at the time was already, he was saying said there was something here which had been lost or obscured in the modern world. And this is a great major theme which we spent lots and lots of time on, this strange thing of how often various people have found in order to advance, you have to go more deeply into the past in order to advance into the future. But then he said we found that all this stuff from the past which we could find was too abstract, it was not practical, and it couldn't be understood by a modern Western audience. And so he said, no, we're going to sort this out and represent it in a way suitable for the West. And this is a clear statement of his intention and what he was doing. And I'd say, I won't go into it in this particular session. That's what he and these people did when they created the Enneagram. The Enneagram is not something they found from the ancient past, but they created it to do that job of translating ancient wisdom into something which would be comprehensible to a Western audience. Then he also came up with this famous formulation, which I adore, and many people take it as crucial for understanding Gurdjieff, and that was the injunction to take the wisdom of the East and the knowledge of the West, and thirdly, then search. And this I want to make a fundamental feature of the fourth way as the Rage presented. The fourth way is a search, and rather than treat it as something which is the, I was just thinking of the phrase you can get in various travel agencies, lost and found. You know, the notion lost nonsense, and they found it and now can present it to you again. No, it's not just finding something from the past, though he dwells on it frequently. It is a transformation of this knowledge, because people who come into this realm, or is this realm of inquiry into what is real in a very realistic way, as requires them to do something new. Not simply following a pattern which somebody has dug up out of a tomb, but to join in an enterprise. But this is my attitude, may not be yours. Now, the picture then we have of Gurdjieff is his involvement in trying to attract interest in Russia, get this interest, and then events conspiring. And I say he was forced, and showing again this tremendous enterprise going south out of Moscow to Near East, and evading, fighting armies, doing weird things like investigating dolmens and so on. It's a dramatic story, partly which told by the de Hartmanns. I mentioned Thomas de Hartmann is with his wife Olga, and he traveled in entourage, some with some of his Gurdjieff's family and some of his pupils, because things back home were pretty rotten at the time of the revolution, people being killed and imprisoned and all the rest of it. Surviving through all of that, eventually getting down into, say, Tiflis, Georgia, where he carried on his enterprise and made the first demonstrations of his movements. I think it was in Tiflis. And where did these movements come? They came out of work being done on this struggle of the magicians. But what the actual connection between them is hardly known. It's just, we know that he started to having these movements, and they were an integral part of his teaching. And I'll just mention it straight away here, that he often said that many things, he said he really would want to be best understood or remembered as a teacher of dancing. I think it's sometimes called teacher of temple dancing. And he valued these movements very much, and I should try to come to it as speedily as possible. Now, I want to move on to recognizing what came out with his teaching and his method. Remember, he was doing this mostly face-to-face, so to speak. You see, you mentioned the conditions in these meetings and so on. He would always never would allow people to take notes or anything like that. So what did people do? You have to realize that sort of writings and so on. We have people who were at his meetings and talking to him, and they couldn't take notes at the time, and they certainly had no tape recorders. And so they went to cafes after meeting with him and exchanged notes and wrote it up themselves, and all the various talks and early talks were done in that fashion. And also because, of course, he was delivering them usually in Russian or some language they didn't understand, or they was not generally understood. And so this content, and I can only do it such a tiny fragment, I want to emphasize very much. And it came just a couple of days ago. I was involved in a small dialogue group of fourth way people, and one of them really said this major thing which you see in Gurdjieff, not in any other spiritual teacher, and that he definitely says, when you are born, you do not have a soul. And this is such an affront to so many people. Because every spiritual teacher goes on about your soul is like built into an Orthodox religion like Christianity. People are born with a soul and they have to look after the soul. But he said, no, you haven't even got one. And it takes something special to make the damn thing. You don't get a free gift. You've got to make it your own. But you can't imagine how radical that was. And it's still largely radical. Um, so Gurdjieff, because they stuck his neck out and actually spoke in such a way, which would be even more, this is being shocking than some rant by Donald Trump. You say, you are just machines. You're not conscious. You don't have a soul. Boy, have you got a problem. Yeah. And everybody else was going on about their spiritual nature and all that sort of thing. And I also mentioned here, because I have to squeeze it in some to everybody emphasize that there's no record ever of Gurdjieff ever doing anything like meditation in his life. And I'll come to his exercises in a moment about this, what he did with this inner work. It was always radically different. So, but he was working largely through these personal contacts. In his oral transmissions, as I say, he would engage with them, and there was this kind of uncertainty, duality with him, with whether he was transmitting something inwardly to them as well as what he transmitted outwardly. It's never definite or clear, and this is very important because he didn't make any kind of claims like that, though he sort of exercised paranormal phenomena like telepathy in certain cases. And later on, he just really got into this whole theme of the nature of psychic powers, which he eventually surrendered or gave up in his own inner work. But there he was with this radical message, and then he was came down through Russia, and he had then trying to find a location in Europe. But then it became a story of him trying to transmit into this European or Western civilization some of the things he was doing. And I say one of the things he was doing was not just handing on some kind of ancient knowledge, though he talks about this quite a lot. It was actually something which he had authentically generated with this supposed group of people. And the only one we know for sure belonged to this group of people, or all the people he mentions in his second book, Meetings of Remarkable Men, of course, his father and his first tutor, Bear Bosch, he met as one of his teachers in the Kars Cathedral, where he sang as a choir boy, because he became very early on educated in music and so on. So what happened is he found his way. You can look up the story. He might have even settled in England, but they were scared of his political background, so he eventually ended up in France. And he was set up his institute there. And you imagine this is his story, the picture of it is those kind of constant things going wrong and failure and having to renew in some way, which is almost itself a teaching lesson about things going wrong and getting things wrong, actually fundamental to advance, which he's sort of exemplified, I don't know, willingly or not willingly. And so the only thing that happened to you is many of you know that he got involved in, because he soon picked up a motor car and started driving. And of course, typically at a time, I don't think they have tests for driving and anything or driving license. And so he was working very hard in many directions, like doing business in Paris while he was running his institute. And he had a fatal crash, and there's a whole mystery about that. Gurdjieff said, "My own old enemy has got me," which led him to revise his whole approach, because he was trying to transmit something through the people he could interact, and he sort of realized, or he says he realized, this is only hearsay, I don't know for sure, that he couldn't transmit through these people. People were not strong enough or able enough or enough, to spread his message. He wanted to get the message across, but how to do it. So he's so reluctant to. He said he would undergo writing, and I believe him when he said he hadn't done writing before as such. I don't know how much of this is true, but had to start again, and he claimed as always he would do it like nobody else has ever done it before. And for me, it's just totally remarkable he was as a writer with the 3 books of his series, main series, the Otherwise Tells, Meeting the Remarkable Men, Life is Only Real, Them and I Am, how totally different they are in nature. The one, a great new mythology, the second one, a kind of fiction, with a fictional autobiography, I call it, because there's no evidence for most of what he says in there at all. And the final one, rather like in the English, the Western tradition of the Confessions. And I really loved his third series, Life is Unreal, Then When I Am, because it's almost like a piece of experimental European literature in some ways. But it also starts off with an incredible, well, it starts off, it's got various versions that start different ways. Version about saying he begins with his failure of his application of his own stated method, which is the way of conscious labor and intentional suffering. It wasn't working for him. He had to devise a new way. And when I read this, I thought, oh, this is incredible. I like this guy. He can actually throw away all he's developed and start all over again. But that was him. That was really him. He could do that. And that was part of it, I think, his real message. Not that he's got the answer and here you are, which most people apply. They all think that we got spiritual teacher. They know things. He's got it sussed out. He knows the pattern. No. So many things he got involved with had this very enterprises, even, that towards his life he was going to get building up a business in America, selling carpets and all that sort of thing. And then the depression or the markets, the Wall Street crash came, and he lost it all in that. So what did he do? He started taking up writing, and because he was physically impaired and so on, and tremendous, meaningful stories in the third series of writings about his mother and wife and their suffering from cancer and what he could and couldn't do in meeting with you. But it's playing with his description of his behavior, which is actually completely contrary to what one would expect. He would just go away or tell of his leading people like de Hartmann to go away and leave him, and which distressed him very much. As de Hartmann went away and had to earn a living as a making film music and so on. And it's so lovely to hear, like my friend Ilan Seacroft, some of you know. He has been recording de Hartmann's own music when he was separate from Gurdjieff, so because, again, this is so important. One of the themes in Meetings of Remarkable Men, the second book, is for me actually major for me, because it's called Meetings of Remarkable Men. Now, he describes these remarkable men as people who can die an honorable death, so to speak. But I took it much more in terms that he talked about people remarkable because they could cooperate together. This is, I think, has been not hardly noticed. And I will say to people today, we can become remarkable men because we can actually work together and cooperate together. And then people say, oh, that's nice. No, but you actually find in practice that very few people can actually cooperate together at all. It's a very major kind of work to cooperate with other people. That's another story I can hardly go into, but it comes to the second part of what I'm going to talk about. So there he was. So we had this connection with the written word, and it's also significant to mention here that as probably a lot of you know this already, that he was said later on after the Second World War in Paris and talking to people, and he first heard for the first time Ouspensky's book, Search and Miraculous. He hadn't known what was in it before. And he said two things. And he said, first, he said, I love Ouspensky now because he write what I say. And this lovely notion, he write what I say. So he acknowledged the truthfulness and accomplishment of this. But the way I do it in Beelzebub is the right way to do it, not as though he do it. And what did he do before up in Russia and so on? See, he came to Russia with a whole bag of tricks, so to speak, and including this bag of tricks, the Enneagram. This was one of them. Then he had all these tables of hydrogens, and he had this wonderful thing, the diagram of everything living. He had this picture of the human food factory, the transformation of substances, all of which, whatever he or his friends or them together had done, had derived largely from 19th century science, because there were people, in chemistry who were developing this language of triads and octaves in chemistry before he ever mentioned them. You see, it was already there in the early 19th century, because there's strictly this man, Englishman called Newlands, who before Mendeleev and so on talked about octaves in the arrangement of the elements. And he was ridiculed by his fellow chemists until Mendeleev did his work, and then he was acclaimed and took into it. But anyway, all of that kind of scientific thing is portraying it probably analogous to what the Theosophists try to do as a scientist, as a super scientist or something. But he made this jump when writing. And there was, I think it's 1923, it could have been, when he dictated the first lines of Beelzebub to Olga de Hartmann. And he pictured these people on this spaceship, Karnak, traveling through the void to meet somewhere in the universe in a certain year. I think he mentioned the particular year, and that was the announcement of this. And he went through working on this book over a long time, and lovingly, and his description of how to work at it, and how he would write it in cafes and so on, which I really thought appreciated. So it's been for me very significant for that, and it's a general cultural thing in Europe. And even in England, with these cafes and drinking coffee and so on, it's part of this enabling people to have conversations and do inner work and so on, better than sitting in a silent study. The writings, though, were, as I intimated, and a part of what I call a kind of working trinity. He had the three things. He had the writings, he had the music, and he had the movements. I must briefly address the thing about the movements here in particular, and to say that when he's emphasized movements so much, I think, well, rushing through my brain, how can I start? Well, first of all, say about the movements, they're presented, first of all, as the kind of his versions of things he picked up in Central Asia, done in various cultures. But more and more people realized he was deeply involved in absorbing things from European culture. Like I said, in Meter of Argument, he actually mentions the time he was meeting these so-called dervishes, he was practicing what was called Swedish gymnastics. And I was very surprised to learn about that. And you look at it and you say, no, yeah, this was being followed by millions of people at the end of the 19th century, and he was part of that. And other things from Europe he picked up. And this leads me to emphasize something important in his writings, which affects in his writings as well, that he could use anything. And there was a story after the war, Second War, with talking to Bennett, and he said, "Do you know where I get some of my words from?" I think he was talking about the word Bulmarshano from Beelzebub. And he took him outside and said, "Look, across the road was a butcher, which had the name Bulmarshano on it." He just thought, he said, "I saw this and I thought it's a nice word." So he put it up. And he would do it. And I really claim, I won't go into a justification of it, that he probably read, and much to my surprise anyway, H.G. Wells and Rudyard Kipling. And I think is in Meet and Remarkable Men, you get a story which I think is derived from Rudyard Kipling. And the stories of the Gobi Desert were derived from Swedish explorers and so on. But what the hell? Because he was a true artist, and because you use what you use, what you can find. And that remain for me a kind of course. It's the utilization, it's the ability. The fourth way is also to use the what is it, the materials of the time you're living in. Whatever it is, you can use it for that purpose. And I'll come back to it hopefully a bit later on. But what a good illustration it was. You see, you don't have to be stuck up about it. I only want to use the something with a brand name of Gurdjieff on it or something. No, use those attitudes. Use anything. It's a sign of your intelligence. It's a recognition of this fact we live in a kind of plenum or field of humanity, and it's changing radically with time and the exchanges going on and so on. But there is this wonderful theme of supplies of energy in his great metaphor, one time, which is about knowledge. He said, know things, but you can add it to that, to really know things, you're forced to do with that crude technique, putting really in front of it, really know things, having real knowledge and all that emphasis on it. But you've got to understand what this real means in any context. But he said about it that it's like gold. And you could, if it was this real knowledge, he said it's finite and it's spread amongst everybody, then each person would hardly get anything worthwhile having. It's only because most people reject this knowledge. And that was such an interesting observation, you see, because he was right on the ball again pragmatically. The last thing that people want to do is know what's really going on, to know anything real. They don't want to know. They want nice stories. What these nice stories do, they enable them to sleep on, without being disturbed. But remember, there is a Gnostic background to the notion of waking up very much, and this notion, well, you get it in literature with James Joyce and trying to awake from the horror that is history. He phrased it slightly differently, but it's that in the sort of Gnostic documents, you get that sense of waking up for it. Why? Because it's the world, the only world that people know, is the creation of the demiurge, which is not Bennett's demiurge, a totally different attitude. The demiurge, which has made this fictional world, which is his nightmare, and we're living part of his nightmare, supporting him in his role as the creator. He is the false god, and the rest of it. So all of that referred to, there's also strong metaphors, you can call it, using the word metaphor as for what's happening in our society. And you can see it everywhere, all these systems, whether technological or economic and so on, which are designed to keep people asleep and stupid. And this is the rule of things. And he had scathing things to say about education, which I think are really apparent. It's such an atrocity, the whole damn thing of it. But everybody goes along with it. You can see everybody. It's not, and it comes out sometimes in this horrific persecution of minorities and so on and so on, the lies being told everywhere and everywhere. And he was making a stand against all of this. But remember, he was brought up in an area which was subject to a lot of ethnic conflicts. His own father and one of his sisters and her children were murdered by the Turks in the time of the Armenian massacres, which is heartbreaking to read about. And he went through all of that, in a sense, impartially, that is, he didn't hate the Turks because of it or anything like that. But for him, it seemed to be a burning question about this psychosis which are infecting populations everywhere in the world. So leaders and so on, they just exploit this. And so people do these stupid things and kill each other and destroy and the rest of it. So there was this sense of catastrophes facing mankind, which he had in his historical treatments, which is so intense and wide-ranging, I can't begin to address it. But I just want to get to this sense of the value of what he was preparing. So I mentioned the three things, which are not simply that the writings to do with the thought or thinking, music to do with feelings, and the movements to do with moving of bodies, but that they are just three ventures of another kind. They all involve each other so radically. But then there's this fourth one about this work with the inner exercises, which I shall come to in a moment. I just see I've almost done an hour here, and so they're not too bad, so I have to come to that exercise very soon. I tried to give you a picture of this and what he was doing. He had something really to impart, but I have to put in here a sort of very wide-reaching statement, which again came from just my recent experience with my friends in a small dialogue group about Gurdjieff workers. Like somebody said, you might be surprised. They said, in a way, you could Gurdjieff was always telling you what not to do, but rarely telling you what to do. You might find that very strange, but think about it, because this thing is a very powerful current in his work. You see, which is that he's always very conscious, reminding us, you like he said about experiences, you only have a finite number of experiences. You must be economical with them. You see, he said, you're not an infinite being. You've only got so much. They call it so much oomph. You see, and you've got to be wise about this. So you can't waste it. You've got to stop wasting it. So a simple thing about the body, which a lot of body workers are aware of, is that you waste most of your energy, which is connected with the organism and so on, because you do unnecessary movements. You fidget and you add stress in your body. One's ordinary reaction to stress in one's body is to make it worse. Why? Because you do not know what your body is doing. So this is a great theme. I wish I had the time to develop, because it's so much like an extension of that wonderful, wonderful thing he said about one time. He said, do you want to know about my work? I'll tell you what it's like. He said, it's like this. And it's to realize that when it rains, the streets are wet. And you go, what? That's it. These are the things that people are ignoring, are the most obvious things which they believe they know and understand. They haven't a effing clue about. This constant self-deception in the everyday things, going in minute by minute, day by day, hour by hour, the same deceptions, and produce these extraordinary statements you seem extravagant. man cannot do, He is asleep. He's not conscious. And everybody goes, what the hell does he mean? So this is that sort of picture of him I want you to leave it with. But I have to make a pause and try and segue into the chance of an exercise. This is as I've implied before, or said before, that it's not a meditation. It's definitely not a meditation. And I have no time to go into a discourse on what I mean by this, but it's not a meditation. It's actually the emphasis is always on intentionality and two things which are emphasized in that sort of inner work. And it is one connected with the body, and the second is connected with words, which are, well, I've been for some time. You could say approximately or to some degree, whatever it is not generally recognized, because yes, taking the body and say, yes, people are very aware of body, and I think it's one of the important manifestations in coming into the 20th century, that the nature of the body is becomes recognized as absolutely important in our being and our spirituality, even. You see, it's as it wasn't the previous days. And there's been a whole kind of change from the time of Plato and the Greeks, which set the pattern of thinking for the medieval Europe. That is where the spiritual was connected and linked with the intellect. Then, I think about 1,000 years ago, began to get this influx of what's called in Hinduism Bhakti Yoga, which Gurdjieff called the way of the monk. And the devotional way, from the heart and all that stuff began about 1,000 years ago. And then come into the 20th century and you get the body, and it's so unexpected. I am deviating into there a bit, but I have to establish this thing that it's so important about the body. And it's a strange thing, a pattern you can find. I always find it's there. Like even the saying of Hassan Shushu, the great modern Sufi mystic, and he said, the body is not bodily. What is the real body? People imagine they know what the body is. This is not true in two different senses. In a sense, it's like there is a kind of now recognized neurophysiological things which people have become told about. It's like I said, knowing what your body is doing extraordinary belongs to what's called proprioception, which is the idea developed by one of my tutors, David Bohm, the quantum physicist. And he said he wanted to understand that proprioception was not just where the parts of your body are as they move around in space, but parts of your thinking. And it was just an extraordinary book he wrote on, because thought as a system and so on. But so it's not only that, what the nature of the body is. And I'd have to say that so quickly to establish something for the exercise. I have to just repeat myself and emphasize it's actually, in fact, to me, and I've just Lan has introduced me to extraordinary Alexander teacher. He's working with Misty Vineyard about this, and reading her book and so much. All I can do at this distance. This sense of people arose in the West, like Christopher Alexander, who was an actor and had this trouble with his voice and learned things. But you realize, when people look at the body and try, it's the ordinary thing in the world. You say, oh, you're bending over, straighten yourself up and all this kind of thing. What instruction? You see, the flaw in it is that a lot of people are not directly aware of what the body is doing, actually doing. So they may have a deformity, so to speak, but then they add on to it. They're trying to do something which is based on a false picture of what they're actually doing in the moment. So they get, oh, it make their problem worse by trying to change it. And this having, see, that's the thing which people can see concrete, but it takes, like some case studies takes people years to begin to appreciate they know what they're doing. And I just throw in here for free that I'm very interested in modern sort of psychological changes, about different attitudes where now the appreciation of depression and failure as positive things that they weren't before. There was rejected, with this fantasies about, oh, it's doing good and the rest of the nonsense. And they no, they can know it in the don't know you don't so and I'll say it blatantly, you can hate me, you say people don't know what the body is doing, actually doing. And also, excuse me, we don't know what the minds are doing. You actually find in a straight forward by solely the thing which you find most people find unbelievable. Of course, I know what's going on in my mind. Rubbish. This is not true. Uh, and it's the whole problem, People are trying to change things and improve things, but they can't make anything like this effectively because they don't know where they're starting from, what they are anymore. It's like the only if you want to ever change the way you think, you have at least to realize, to understand how you do think now. Unless you can do this, you can't change. But people imagine they can keep on their old habits and ways of doing things and just add little goodies onto themselves so they can go, just like you see people, have comfortable lives or going along, say, well, I add on a little bit of meditation, to give it a bit of cream on top, This is the sort of attitude of it. It's like, oh, whatever. So there's a lot in that. Now, this thing about the body, I've deviated back to a Svensk, as a member, he really was, he was an intellectual, a journalist and so on, and friends that were intellectuals and all that sort of, but he really hit him when Gurdjieff brought up this whole idea of the moving center, that this was, which Gurdjieff did this remarkable thing in the culture of his times. He put this on the same level as thinking and feeling, which broke this old pattern, which you can blame Descartes for, which is the divorce between mind and matter, which is still prevalent as the dominant thought form in our culture. But it broke it and then people were surprised. Excuse me. I'll try and have a little drink here. Because there's that simplistic picture of mind and body is an atrocity. It really is a screw up. No. So Gurdjieff was able to see this, that this is something he was realization. This we call it the body, but this notion of the moving center was very informative. Why? Because it's actually referring moving center to treat about some technicalities here. This as independent what we call the instinctive center. Why? Because the moving center has to do with voluntary movements, instinctive center with involuntary movements. There's also the sex center between them. Oh, it was a radical revolution because other people were coming on the idea, and Steiner had the equivalent, but for some reason he called the third part willing, not just moving, but willing. Now, I'll just try to say one thing now. I'm going to give a pause for you to speak if possible, and that is to say that we should appreciate what Gurdjieff was doing in terms of one requirement. Basically, we have this so-called awareness of ourselves, blah, 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 our special feelings and thoughts, or spiritual impulses, or satanic impulses, whatever they are. But what is, you see, but you can question Descartes' thing, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. There's not thinking at all, which is relevant, but something which Gurdjieff called sensation. That is the bodily sense of the bodily. I can put it at that stage. I'll try and make it better a bit later on. You see, what can you trust? I say you can really seriously question. Descartes did his questioning in a certain mode, and it's different. Questioning is say, in terms of you, what do I feel? What do I know? But what can I be convinced of? And Gurdjieff laid down a framework of reference, he said, which is sensation. And this can use for many people. Remember a dear old lady I knew who they talked about sensation. She said, I can understand why you want to have sensation. He said, I only have sensation when I'm in pain. And the idea of intentionally attending to sensation was really very novel, you see. But I think I'm going to pause. I'll try and get myself to do that before I get too carried away. I mean, Gurdjieff came out with these sort of saying nothing exists except matter and energy. And in some ways, he was very, very much, I think, anchored in the 19th century idea of science. And I differ in my opinion from various other people who love Gurdjieff's work, and they say, oh, he was very au fait with modern science. I really have never seen any evidence he was. So and for example, I believe we have to take into account. I believe this is my attitude is to embrace things which happened, which Gurdjieff wouldn't have known about and didn't know about and didn't appreciate at all, because we're living in that time. It wasn't his time, but he did the best in his time. And he was still a limited person, knowing only what he could know through the things available to him at that time. In spite of saying, of course, he could, which is part of his, I think, deliberate program of, how to say it, stimulating an interest in people when he spreads these legends and ideas and stories about traveling in places inaccessible to Western travelers, which he made a big point of. So this person like him could go there. And because therefore he could talk about hidden monasteries which nobody else knew about, you see, and do that sort of things. And he would also talk in a similar vein about translating an ancient manuscript that had come into his possession. But he never showed anybody any such ancient manuscripts because he probably made it all up himself. But it's a good story. And you say, well, I think he comes from a culture. I remember Lipsy, I remember having a conversation with Lipsy about saying he said Gurdjieff never adjusted to the culture of the people he had to deal with in the West. He was still in the kind of Near Eastern culture, which has a different ethos about storytelling and so on. And the West has this component, which is very weak in a lot of modern people. It's still there, component about hard knowledge, about definite knowledge, empirical knowledge, and so on. which is not suited to the storytelling thing. Let's say, imagine Gurdjieff, say, as an artist who could be sympathetic to the culture of Sherazada. So he's used to telling magical stories. That's the sort of thing. You see, that's his way. But he was not only that, begin to do it. So matter of energy, we don't know energy is, and I was, because my background in academically is the history of science, I say energy as a word came into use in the beginning of the 19th century, and it was an amazing thing to do, because that was the age in which there was the discovery of thermodynamics, which is important for industry, but also for science, because it led into the science of information in 100 years later, in the late 20th century. But blah, blah, blah to all of that. But energy, well, you have this, again, it's the thing which, how can express it in its ways? I'm going to make these generalities and accusations and judgments and so on, so please forgive me for that. That is to say, he would, this appreciation of the finiteness, of our finiteness, very important. Like you only have so much energy, and it's limited. And I'm reminded of something in this respect, which is, for me, I've always been very interested in all kinds of people, like, Jason talking about Steiner. Yes, I tried to appreciate Steiner as much as I could. I haven't read that particular book. I've read other things. But I think it was obvious to investigate other people. And one of my great, heroines, in fact, is Simone Weil. I still remember reading her book, which was Waiting on God. In someone's kitchen. I was just spellbound for a whole hour, completely overcome by her. But she was a very wise person in some respects. She said about virtue, she said, you should only act according to the level of one's virtue. Which seems a strange thing to say, because most people go around trying to be good all the time. Don't you see everybody, and probably you yourself, me myself, we're trying to be good. You see what I'm saying? Well, you see, this fantastic thing. If you try to do good beyond one's actual capacity, it turns into its opposite. And this is, well, again, a kind of message which most modern people would at best disdain, you see, because everybody's trying to be good, And this whole understanding is just misunderstanding completely. You can only do what you can do, you see. And this is all to do with the practicalities of knowing oneself and knowing limitations. And so we have instead these dreams. You can do anything you dream of. Anybody can do anything they want to, and all this, particularly American propaganda and the dream world, it's all this encouraging people to fantasize instead of being factual about themselves. And so there we are. That is to say, we have finite energy, so we have to conserve the energy. And then he talked about it in very sort of 19th century terms, in terms of accumulators. You see, we have for all these things, he called it, like three engines of thinking, feeling, and moving. They have an energy, but it's like the batteries or something, which can, like in a car, they get charged up by the machine running, you see, as well as putting out. So it's in the kind of equilibrium. They said how in special conditions you can maybe concentrate energy. And in one way of doing this is to stop or inhibit useless things in one's life. It's like the images that fidgeting. Why are you? Even I'm here. I'm fidgeting about doing all these movements. You see, all these wasted movements which are not purpose. You don't have to sit around stiffly on your chair or fix it, not like that, but it's like so much is superfluous or needed. And why you can only bother about this, why not just do what the hell you feel like doing? And if you want to gather your force, and so this notion of having a time in the day when you can gather your force or energy or conserve it for something or whatever is the supreme importance. But it only comes if you understand that it's limited. You can't, you as I say, this whole propaganda around you can do what you wish for and all that sort of stuff is so stupid, unbelievably stupid. But that's the world Gurdjieff portrayed to us in his books, and he talks about this, the imaginary lives of people, the nonsense and the deceit going on. He's not really calling them wicked or anything. They're just asleep, and all that kind of stuff. Then you could say, who are you, Gurdjieff, to condemn us all like that? It's not condemning us, he's just pointing out the obvious that one supposes, but I don't know. He's gone through the realization of it himself. So doing an exercise. Now, particular exercise I'm going to show is actually, I call it particular exercise. It's a form or my interpretation today of particular exercise, which people like Peter here knows, called the preparation. As the kind of thing I learned very early on in being with Mr. Bennett. And so in a way it could be said, most of you here will know about it already or some version of it, but it's some version of it. And it's the subtle thing I want to have established right at the beginning, if I can, is that, there's this whole issue here of lines of transmission. You see, first of all, point number one, Gurdjieff presenting these exercises, especially he talks about it in some detail in the third series, Life is Only Real Than When I Am, when he introduces certain exercises for the Arase's group to practice, and because to cure them of something to do with their misunderstanding of self-observation. It was that they had to, how to say, really being invited to understand what they're doing. I had this very strongly in me years ago, and after Bennett died, and I was doing groups, especially with John Wilson, about how the College of Continuous Education people and doing exercise. I kept trying to get them to ask, why are you doing it? What is it for? And I get informed very much by things from movies. I remember this wonderful movie, Light Years Away, based on the French novel La Voix Sauvage, and just by director Tanner, about it was an old guy living in Cork in Ireland in a car, a sort of garage with a scrapyard of old cars around it, and he picks up a pupil from the city. And that's a whole other thing, how he does that, and he's talking to him, and he's exchanging, and in one exchange with this for erstwhile young man he's plucked out of the city in his point in his life, was to say, and he's shouting at him, say, you do things, and you don't know why, and he's horring him. Why do you do things you don't know why? That's what people are doing all the time. They really don't know why. People are doing exercise all over the place. I've got the impression often that the best thing they can come up with, they're doing an exercise because they like it or something like that. But there's no understanding, you see, what it's for or why. Now, the why can touch upon a profound part of Gurdjieff's teaching, which is quite challenging. And that is his speech is talking about inner bodies. Not only you can see how it builds up so incredibly beautifully, because it has to have as a core element this this better concrete understanding of the body as a concrete understanding, utilizing what you can know in books and so on, but certainly, but a concrete understanding, which you understand the basis of the second and the third body, whatever it is. Now, this is an old tradition, you know, and you get this interesting thing that in Christianity, of course, I need to go about the body, soul, and spirit. Everybody goes on about this. I'm always puzzled why people don't really investigate it. Why is there these two words, soul and spirit? What the hell are they? Why does it have two things? Uh, and if you ask, religious people and so on, they're really not the. At least I'd say, well, the two things mean the same thing, and they don't have no idea about the difference between them. I've realized why the two things, and Gurdjieff had this version of the the one that's the soul, but then he invented his own special word for it, body kazjan. But he often did that to make people feel they don't understand what's this funny word kazjan, instead of assuming they know what he means already. But then the third body is just called the higher being body. But sometimes he calls it the soul, and so you get all this mixture and so on about this sort of thing. And why? But what the hell do you mean? I've talked to people who are long in the work, longer than even than I, and it comes up in that book I mentioned to Marilyn about my just personal experience with the fourth way, and I went to Coombe Springs, and I was aware of this, and I kept on being a young chap, so to speak. And so, do any of these people have their inner bodies or so on, or anything like that? And nobody was talking about inner bodies. They usually talk to each other about who was sleeping with who. That was the topic of conversations, you see. And I was so shocked at that, and I was, but their conspiracy, I lost to some of the naivety. I still remember one thing with an event with Bennett. There was a lovely old Norwegian lady called Helly Herstenes, and in the place where we were living there in Kingston upon Thames, and he just turned around one day to her, who was in the house together, and he said, "Lily, do you realize you have your second body?" And she looked up shocked and said, "What do you mean?" I don't know what he means. It's just stuck in my mind ever after. And I've told to various people before, and nobody could, well, the ones I've actually talked to, they nobody wants to lay claim to having an inner body, because you have a culture, which is partly a subculture of the Gurdjieff movement, to say you always have to say you don't know anything and you haven't developed anything and you're a poor wretch and you're trying to get the soul, but you haven't got one, and that was the situation you ought to be constantly striving to do things, and they're never working, and you think, well, maybe have a chance of getting a bit of soul before you die, but you don't know really, and all this kind of thing. You see, it's a real puzzle. You've got this, and the adamant thing that Gurdjieff said about this thing and about he said uh, was the following. He said, in all religions, basically, involves some claim about immortality. And some of what he was about was to say, well, and other people do it, like Steiner, for example. They do it and say, well, we've got these sort of propositions about having a soul and all the rest of it and so on, and all this sort of mythology about what can happen in heaven and so on. But he said the thing about the fourth way or things like it was that it has got a way about the how to. None of the religions really tell you how to do these things at all. They just left you with, I ought to be doing this, or it's like I ought to be better, I ought to be doing good, and so on. But nobody gives any advice about how to do it. So you're just stuck. And he said the thing about this is you get this know-how, this transmission of know-how, and the fourth way is about this transmission of know-how. And this transmission of know-how is an incredibly important thing, but it can't be pinned down. And Gurdjieff's way of doing this demonstrated things which are very far away from the ordinary way of, say, going to college and studying a subject to have a curriculum, you have teachers and exams and all that kind of stuff. It's got none of this because you can really, there is some essential roughness in it, like in the way in which he could be quite ruthless with people, hard with people. That's a whole other topic I shouldn't debate with around here. So the finite picture and this particular exercise called what's called the preparation, which Joseph Aziza said, and everybody wants it, I can give them a reference to one of his long articles. And this is a scholarly article, and he's stuck his neck out and done this, and he's done a special study of Gurdjieff's exercises and so on. Is where he's gone and looked out for all these various streams of the different interpretations. There are different interpretations, but also within any one lineage, it's like they could do this exercise with exercise, and it would be different each day, not the same thing at all. And I have an extreme example that one of my dear friends in the work, I won't tell his name, but he does an exercise, he does it, and I can't do this at all, but the opposite to me, he does it exactly in the same way he learnt it 40 years ago, in exactly the same words, in exactly the same timing. And each time we present it, it does it exactly the same. And for a person of my temperament, this is intolerable. You see, but he he has to do it his way. And Bennett was very strong on this, and he said everybody in the work has their own style. It's maybe contrary to general belief, well, the work is something. It's kind of there's like a formula. It's not, because it's actually genuine for any person. They have to do it their way. You can't do it somebody else's way. And this is why, for me, one of the main functions of group work was not to kind of, in a sense, ordinary sense, learn things, but to interact with people who look at things differently to the way you look at things. That plurality of points of view is essential. Like another quote from Gurdjieff said, "In the fourth way, there are many teachers." But you get unfortunate situations where people are under the control of, well, I'm going to call it the tyranny of a single leader who kind of rules the roost and gives the laws and so on. But no, there has to be this diversity. And I think it is exemplified by Gurdjieff in the meetings of remarkable men, because they're all the incredible piece of writing with such distinctive characters. There's this transmission, and he used this wonderful way in the third theory as a phrase. I don't think I've mentioned it yet. In giving an exercise how to do it, and he called it illustrative inculcation, if I got that word right. That is to say, it's a certain, we can redefine it. The person transmitting the exercise does the exercise as he's talking about it to other people. That's a very else need to do, but it's very, very important to get that, because it makes it, can you use the word organic, personal. There's a transmission, person to person of an energy. Now I'm looking at the time, I see it's now, I've only got theoretically 20 minutes left or something like this, so I'm in the dead shtuk again. And I thought I was being very economical in my time. It shows how much aware of myself I am, which is very little. And so I apologize to that, but I have to move on to it. But it's just a matter to speak about this. Most people come along doing exercises, none of them have even begun to thought about why they are doing it. They set this notion, it feels good. That's about as much they come with, But I say, well, I'll go through it this way. I say, this, I'm trying to establish in you, there are so different ways of doing it. This exercise is so profound. It has so many ramifications. expressions and modalities, and the one I want to start with was take it as far as we can, is which I've about, and you may not have come across it, some of you have done the preparation this before, but this is the way I've come across it. You come across your own way of doing it. And it's to do with self-examination, um, which is an optional. You see, so people like to do it. And I'm showing you two ways of starting this exercise. One was self-examination, which is literally, not to me, self-examination. You're sitting there, coming down, you're sitting there, and you're actually checking out, how is it with me now? Where am I beginning from? And say, well, yeah, you actually make it self-aware. I'm sitting in this chair, things like that. And I don't want to elaborate because you have to investigate it for yourself. What it means to say, you got to check out, to have the thought, yeah, or the knowledge. I'm sitting in this chair now. When is it? When, where? That kind of thing. That's the first check-in. The second check-in is, do I wish to be here? I say, well, I'm sitting here. No, but do I wish to be here? Because it's already introducing this great theme, which is one of good, normal themes of wish, the power of wish. You can write things down to catch it. So if you're thinking it, you're sitting down, you're going, oh, bloody hell, it's that time again, or I'll get through this, whatever it is. But you've got to, it's a checking of honesty, because honesty comes with this direct awareness in the feeling center. What am I really feeling? What am I really wanting? And you can go through a whole process of that. And then third thing with the mind and so on, say, why am I doing this? And I say to people, you've got to find a reason why you're doing it. And yes, you can refer to a theory if you like, but you have to say, well, have you understood this theory about, or it's for helping me build an inner body and that thing. And I used to often use the sense in some way or other, which I don't understand, but I believe in doing this exercise helps the condition of other people who suffer or in suffering. And it's rather like Gurdjieff used to point out, it's the one thing that really motivate people to work on themselves is the benefit it may accrue to their children, because they would work for the sake of their children more than for themselves. And I say, it is incumbent upon you why you do the exercise. Of course, you can read books about it and so on, but you have to find your own real reason. Why? Just because this is one way of attuning your three centers. It's not the only way, so I have to rush over that. Now, go to the one basic form of this exercise. I said that what I've described as optional is something which I found extremely valuable to do. So it's rather like this need to set what I call a time zero. Right? What is the starting, getting to a starting point? Because often I've done it myself, I experienced it, to go into sitting down, doing an inner exercise, and I got all this dream and stuff going on with me and thinking what I'm going to have for breakfast and all the rubbish. No, but it's this honest to God recognition of how you are is a great blessing. The other thing then is was simply called when I first learned it, and it's in the Spiritual Miraculous, a remarkable thing, and it's to do with relaxing and filling, was the phrase of it. Now, relaxation, as everybody knows, we're supposed to know about relaxation, but it's not so straightforward as all that. I always remember in the 18th century, it was regarded as a disease, actually, in a medical thing, but that's another story. But what do you say? Why relax? And so what the hell does it mean? Uh, how to do it? And everybody uses the word. You can either be in, just relax to say to other people, relax, with one of those magical words, which God knows what it means to various people and so on. How do you do it? You don't really know how you do this relaxation. But I'll tell you, an important element I want to speak about now, which we conceive of the time we may not even get to it, is the way in you do it in direction. So the traditional way was relax from head to toe, and you fill from toe to head. You don't have to do it this way, but that's the way which was transmitted in the early days with Gurdjieff. Now, and I'm going to do something with you just straight away with that because it would help. I've only got 10 minutes left. And that is, you begin with the head. And the relaxation is a mystery. You can, in fact, in some of the exercises, there's a thing about 7 degrees of relaxation. And I always found it interesting, and you can take it as a practice, to begin with the eyes, because I had myself a lot of experience of tension associated with the eyes, the muscles around the eyes, and how it can be traced to all things in my body and so on. And there's an enormous amount of energy which goes into the muscles around the eyes. And in general, in the face, there are 72 muscles. And so, but as you're now listening to me drone away, you can look at be aware of your own eyes, and even picture, if you like, your eyeballs. Now, you see, even here, you can have all sorts of variations of how to go about this. It used to be one way was that you could physically, you could either exercise your eyeballs, so look up, look down, look left, look right, and you rest, and you can do that a number of times. Or you can some of you might get it, and it's putting a lot on you. You don't actually move your eyes, but you visualize moving your eyes. So imagine, if you like, whatever word suits you, you're looking up, but you don't actually look up. And you imagine you look down, and you look left, and you look right. Now, when I do that, it's immediately produces an effect much stronger than actually doing it up and down, left and right. Now, you begin to get this relaxation around the eyes, you reconnect with the whole facial complex. And the detail one can go into is extreme. I used to do it sometimes, spending a whole hour just doing this relaxation. And it is very profound because you can become experienced in these organs, like the eyes, and realize these connections, which can be worked at, by technical means in body work and so on, but maybe a revelation about how much your eyes are connected with tensions in your back and all this sort of thing. Now, I want to add in here this thing about posture. And I will soon have to stop, unfortunately. But posture, you do to sit in a certain way on a chair. When I began to learn the exercises, it was the time when everybody sat on chairs. Then we went to Sherman and so on, and everybody was sitting on the floor. This was partly economics because there wasn't enough money to pay for chairs as well as cushions. So cushions were very economically useful, but people got used then to sitting cross-legged on cushions. They weren't before, used to sitting on chairs. And you get this notion of the spine. And I said about the went into your body and how you can feel the weight of your head and how it's on your torso and your pelvis, and you get an alignment. It's not a straight line and straight line, it's conceptually a straight line. And you get this sense of balance, which is very helpful. And you're kind of freeing then, around one's stomach area and all that sort of thing into this right posture. But here I have to make a comment, and it's a sort of meta comment on the exercise. That is to say, you come to an exercise, you sit down, you sit and you're taught to relax in order. In a way, this is your responsibility. There's enough available now in the general culture to help you have trouble. I mean, for example, when I started doing things, I had great tensions in my stomach. Well, I had to learn how to work on paying attention, putting sensation into my stomach muscles and so on, to relieve this tension before I could really open myself towards the experiences which I needed to experience. You have a duty then to find out how to make these things work. And then a great commentary on that, and I'll see how I can manage to fit that in the time remaining. And then you learn entirely. It is an accumulative process. You learn to find this clearing out. And I always imagined, taken for me, you find your own metaphors. You need to find your own metaphors which work for you. From early medieval plays where you have the mummers and the person going sing with a brush and sweeping, and he would be the sweeper to clear the decks. And this was actually symbolic for me. It was what you do. You have to sweep the floor, and this means to clear the field of one's awareness of the body. Clear the stage is the opening for something to enact on here. And it begins you get a certain taste for this clarity. It's a kind of cleanness which comes through the body. And so then one can have this practice, because you can't do all these things every time, where you come down, let's say, from top to toe, go down, and you come to the mouth and the tongue, the weight of the tongue on the floor of the mouth. Yeah. Special organs like then you can go, and I think it's a very valuable one to go into the larynx, the voice box. Why? And there's a reason for this. Why? Because you can relax into this the voice box. Then your kind of subconscious verbal mental associations are diminished, because when you get the mental associations, there is a subliminal activity in the larynx accompanying it. So you can relax the larynx, you ease off the associations. And so you go on, and you can go intimately, and I can't go through it in this particular stage. And you find how to discover about your body and the bones and the muscles and the ligaments and what they're like. And when you come to your hand, and it's like you have to have a kind of X-ray vision of your hand. It's like, I think there's 15 main bones in the wrist. And so it's like your tension is like a fluid going between the bones and so on, and you bring it down in detail. At certain times, you don't need to do as always, to even come out to the ends of your pinky, and that's your tip of it. It's actually in this relaxation. So this clearing is also articulating the body, bringing you into a wholeness of the body. And then this practice of filling with what? With sensation. This word sensation is absolutely of critical importance, and it's always an undeveloped thing. And I've been trying myself to understand more deeply, drawing on various sources of modern neurophysiology and so on about this, because it's something so remarkable, and it's mostly ignored by general psychology, not referred to at all as being really significant. And as I said with my story of the old lady, sometimes only think about sensation in terms of the sensation of the senses, or pain or pleasure, like in sex or something like that, but actually doing it deliberately. I dwell on this. I apologize for boring you with this. Here on this, because it's this whole invitation you get from the fourth way to draw attention on things which people ignore because it's just to them simply a device to get things which you desire. I say, even in my own life, I've taken, it may seem silly to you, a lot of attention on reaching for a cup of tea. Now, nearly every time I do it, I get this awareness of reaching out for it and what's happening to it. And I can see there's one way in which it's all your actions like this, gestures going, grabbing hold of things. It's all expressing what you want and what you want to do and all the rest of it. It's all of it is permeated with that. You can't just let the action be the action. So this early preparation is of great significance. But then Gurdjieff made it into a substance, and it is like a substance. And the point of it was this, that you do it, if you now sense like, what does it mean? Well, trying to explain. Like even going into your right hand now. Suddenly something you feel that something is in that right hand which is not in your left hand. And you have to do it in such a way you are absolutely sure that it's in the right hand. Because that is your point of reference of reality. That is your yardstick. You see, the contrary to Descartes about thinking is sensing. You cannot doubt your right hand. So that feeling of presence, you can go through, then fill your whole body. Sometimes I say to picture, or have people said to me about, it's like treating yourself as a vessel which is being filled from the bottom up, like a liquid which comes up through your legs, which may be even drawing energy from the earth into your abdomen, up, and eventually ending up at the head. And see, that's all that. I'll just go on for 10 more minutes over time. Yes. As I'm rushing through these parts of it, if you ever undergo something, people you know who practice it, you develop certain patterns of it. But there's so much to explore in this preparation, so many different ways of doing it. And a good practitioner, I always have that attitude that each day will be different. And you might find different areas to investigate, to spend time on. It's for you to do it, because this is the fourth way. You're not following formula. It's all based on understanding. Understanding, yes, it has a mental component, but that's the main thing is this understanding for Gurdjieff was meant all three systems together in concert, together in harmony, harmonious development, getting these things lined up. It's absolutely revolutionary. Now, if you could, I can imagine or suggest we pretend, if not, this concreteness, you cannot doubt, at least, whatever your mind is doing, whatever else is happening on, there is this body. If you study Mr. Bennett's work, you do incredible discourses on the nature of the body. It's the miraculous. So this old way of a culture of treating the body as inferior was absolute nonsense. Well, there is this body. And now, one sequence, become aware of your breathing. Aware of it. And what Gurdjieff does with the breath is extraordinary. He has a whole theory about was the substances in the breath, in the air itself. But he doesn't usually say one should do manipulations like in Kriya Yoga, where, inhale through one nostril and out through the other nostril, whatever. But no, just to be aware of the breath. And this is a quality I want to emphasize in this work. It is the quality of you responding in the moment into the quality of things. It's not a rigid routine at all. Well, what you're doing is this remarkable thing. It's natural process which just goes on itself mechanically in us all the time, and you're turning it into something which is like opening a door. It's breath, it's there. And I give you an idea of it which may be not helpful at all, but forgive me, still it's the idea about it. See, and he said that you can be aware of a subtle energy inside the air, which we already know in science as oxygen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide and so on. And so you begin with just an idea of that, perhaps. But I say, what happens, you see, there's something which is undeveloped in the Gurdjieff work for a long time. So this phenomena to do with self-observation, self-awareness, and all the rest of it. He only had a limited language for his time. Now you see things happening in modern science which can point out other ways. I don't want to bore and press you with these, but to find for yourself. And it's the notion that you bring awareness into any process, then what it is, that its being, changes. So it doesn't change it actually, but it changes its being, its quality, its essence. And this is a special kind of food. And there's a way of seeing how when you breathe in, and you can pause, become aware of it being assimilated into oneself, taking in. And you may remember this may be associated or have the idea with the formation of your inner body. And so what? It might be just your imagination or concept. Okay, if it doesn't work, you leave it, but just some things being absorbed if you do this with the air, which ordinarily will not be absorbed. And then as you're doing it, I have a little taste of it now, and it produces this vibration, this energy inside you. It's it's like an electricity coursing through your veins. But my approach to this exercise get you had really urge you to follow it as it actually really goes in you, and not force it into any preconception so much. Whereas they use metaphors which help you, and you don't know, you can't see where it goes, perhaps. But still, this loose sense, this seemingly imprecise sense of location is important, because it's this attitude of there is this inward quality of the air which is permeating you. And suddenly, you might find it's like the world lights up. And now you go to your head, and you visualize your head, or even the crude ways they think about your head. It's very hard to find the right words here. And Gurdjieff would always say this, there is a something there. There's something connected with knowing, seeing. And so much of the stuff you could understand is left unformulated, it's for you to find it, because you can't, it's wrong to give it a precise form, though some people using this side turn it into a ritual with a specific way of doing it and certain definitions. You can do it or not do it. It depends on your temperament, what suits you. I'm going to leave it, or no, just say there is this something, you recognize the something, because why it's so important to recognize, because this is what we're doing here is beginning to articulate, to bring into manifestation this tripartite nature of ourselves, with one of the key elements of Gurdjieff teaching, law of three, being enacted in you. And that is how it is. He gave the extraordinary name to it, and called Jotklum. So it's like he said, this special cosmic substance just sort of splits into its three components, separates, and then these begin to come together, because this is what's happening into it, is demonstration, these theoretical terms. So you've done something now which is to do with your body, your feelings, and your mind, you see, and then you're going to allow them, see how they come together. We don't have time to develop these feelings, and I'm just myself occupied with going on to the next part of this, which I hope to get in before I leave you in peace. And that is this, you see, it's called preparation, because it came from some notion of preparation for the day. In the only common sense understanding, we get into the day, our family, our business, where we live, what's going on, the news, what's on the news, whatever it is, all the stuff of life. And the general reasonable idea is that we forget ourselves. We are just this stumbling automaton going around left, right, and center, repeating the same mistakes over and over, whatever it is. But the seeing of one's life, you see, is important. You can't be told what to do or explain what to do about this. And so one thing you can do is to think of some periods of something you know is going to happen in the day to come, and you bring it these elements, and they're to do with wish, and you say, but also can and am, because these three words in the third series, he goes into an extensive extent. Why would he bother? He goes on about these words, wish, am, can. Why? And the words. They say yes, because amongst other things, Gurdjieff was a master of words. Words. Not being in your head or concept, but words that he knew. So there are ways of doing this exercise I can't go into now, which actually concentrate on these words. But the primary one I have to mention is, which permeates his work, when you say the word I, become aware of how it reverberates in you. That is his words, I can't think of anything better. Even if it doesn't work for you, just open yourself there. Because it matters, because it touches me in a trivial way, perhaps, when I'm saying emails, and I keep starting sentences with the word I, and this upsets me every time. I can't stop myself doing this. You see, whenever you say the word I in life, it is a hazard every time. So you can find this reverberation in you. It's like a sacred trust. Then you visualizing a time in the future where you'll be doing something, in your office, in your home, on a journey, and you bring this wish in you to remember yourself. I've used those magical words, remember yourself, which are, as people know Gurdjieff is the central tenet of it. You see, it was very interesting in a way, Gurdjieff never explained what the hell he meant by it. And Bennett used to say, snarkily, so to speak, in ways, he never understood it. He said, what's it got to do with self or remembering what this something is? But I'll stick to Gurdjieff's words. And as I got enough, and it may be for you like me, just a fleeting touch, and I get, that's it. Then you can't contain it, you can't hold it, because it's not suited to memory or thought or concept or anything like that. It is something so direct. So I think it's one of the greatest gifts, which Gurdjieff gave to people. So this world of the exercise of preparation is like so rich and it's so diverse when you get into it. And as you say, I encourage you to treat if you do this exercise every time you do it as a new opportunity of investigation, because this for me is the essence of the fourth way, but it's not as it's seen by other people. I think, well, for me, this is my own attitude. When anybody claims that they know what the teaching really is or what these things really mean, and you can see there is the incentive then in them for them to tell other people what it means and so on, that there is something wrong. And you think, why should we not be able to pin it down and thrash it out what it really is? No, it's not like that in this world. There is this thing which is hinted at by Bennett's thing about having your own style. I used to remember him telling me, whatever feelings you have about your own wretchedness, you mustn't let it cramp your style. You have to be true to yourself. And then people get frightened and say, no, it means they have to be subjected. I say, no, but you just have to recognize. You have to treating it as a musical analogy. Play yourself, perform yourself in life. And I like the saying of Dolly Parton. I thought she was a total genius when she said you have to find out who you are and then do it on purpose. I thought she was the best philosopher America ever produced. What an insight. So that's going to be my last message of you. I so apologize because typically I start with these good intentions so you can see what happens. Doing it right timing, and I can say, oh, I've given enough space to do it. Well, I've given nothing. It goes into its own opposite, completely contrary to how I pictured it. But I hope you get a taste. And to say this about the emphasize, you see, there's a way you can't treat this work like it's a way of mind. It can get treated in a very fixed manner. I like the story of the Gurdjieff, which is said like he would, one period of his life, he would throw away whatever money he had accrued in every day and start afresh the next day, which is very symbolic of this starting from nothing. And this attitude is different from one which seeks to accumulate brick upon brick. And I say it's very false, and you can't do this by say, oh, I do the simple steps. You know, like people teach you the simple steps, and then you can do the more complicated steps and so on. I think this is utter rubbish. You know, I always found my life with certain things. The first time you do them, you get it, and thereafter you've got to what you have to battle with is that you're thinking you've got it, which is screwing you up to not getting it. That the way of the fourth way should be an opening of doors and not putting a notice in your window saying truth for sale. But and it opens, it's like Jason was saying about China, yes, and how Bennett at one time the wish debate to follow himself wanted to do an encyclopedia of spiritual techniques, and he would definitely include Steiner, who he greatly admired. I think one time he was going to work with Steiner. But all these other people, and also mathematicians, scientists, psychologists, artists, but artists, and so I mention one or two last things, and then I'll give you some rest. And that is when this talking about types, which came as that I'm going to say dreadful. It's not entirely dreadful. It's interesting, but I regard a dreadful version of the Enneagram done by Oscar Chazo in cohorts. Enneagram of personalities and so on. It's the leaving the ones that it's about something you've arrived at and worked out, and types and all that kind of thing. And that I still say, you look at Gurdjieff, he was asked about types and how his response was absolutely wonderful. So he used to say, he said, there's all these various systems. In the end, he said, it can't be put into a system. And then he said, it's an art. It's not a science. It's an art. I really love that about him. Because to me, Gurdjieff's become a consummate artist, and he's recognized these things that, essentially have to be transmitted. And the transmission itself is an art. It's not a science. It's an art. So learn to be artistic with ourselves is one of the key messages, but it's not the common one. Now, I don't know about the future, you folks. I apologize for my mistake, which is the one I always make. about misuse of time, or maybe not misuse. But thank you for this opportunity to get into this, because it's me and my, if I can speak for my colleagues in the university too, hopefully they won't be upset by what I say, that we become almost fans of failure because it's general. In general, there's been this new understanding and appreciation of failure, how we can only advance through failure. And so what you get wrong is the way you can get things right. And this is, I think, Bennett, how articulate he was in his massive book, The Dramatic Universe. He, you know, seemed to be explaining everything, but in a way he worked against himself. He got that way, started one way, was done the complete opposite to what he intended, which he said was to point out how that is the absolute limitations of our powers of certainty and knowledge, and the decay of absolute systems of knowledge which have ruled the world, and of course still ruling it in political parties and religions and all the rest of the crap, even versions of science. So, appreciate that living in the unknown, because one thing about this unknown, which you can get a taste of in such exercises. I've made this little version of it, talking with you just now. Forgive me for its limitations. It gives you a chance to taste this, I use the metaphor, this open road or this open door. And that's the precious thing. Who cares who's right, who's wrong, or what you think you know or don't know? But it's just Gurdjieff gave you a chance to test it out for yourself and to go in your own direction. This means going in your own direction doesn't mean that you're going away from other people into some kind of subjective idiosyncrasy, ignoring other people. No. So by doing the way you do things in your own way, that you can begin to truly communicate with other people. So bless you for being patient. This is me trying to communicate to you. I'm sorry it's so one way. In spite of all my intentions and beliefs, I did the opposite. And talked and talked. And so forgive me and thank you and good night.